They told me to stay quiet, smile, nod, blend in. But something inside me had started to burn, quietly, for years now. The moment my boss leaned toward me before the gala and whispered, "Just stay quiet tonight. Let the others shine," I knew I was done obeying. I smiled back like I always did, controlled, polite, but something snapped inside, not in anger, in clarity. That night, I was wearing the same navy blue dress I always wore to company events, safe, modest, unmemorable. Just like they liked me. Professional, they called it. But what they meant was unthreatening, unremarkable. I was hired for my ideas, but trained to be invisible. And for years, I played along. I kept my head down, delivered results, let others take the credit. I laughed at the jokes that weren't funny, nodded in meetings even when my stomach turned. I was good at being the shadow behind their spotlight. But I didn't start this way. I used to be fire. Before the company, before the layers of silence. There was a version of me that dreamed of standing on stages, holding microphones, saying things that made people feel something. Words used to be my power. But my family never thought much of that. "It's cute you like to write," my sister used to say. "But when are you going to get a real job?" Even at dinner, my dad would talk about my brother's sales figures like they were gospel. When I mentioned I won a national speech competition in college, he changed the subject to stocks. That silence wasn't new to me. It followed me into adulthood like a curse. I remember sitting in my first job interview at the company, voice shaking, palms sweaty, but heart full of hope. I told them I had ideas for transforming internal communication and creating authentic engagement. They said I was refreshing. I was hired within a week. The first 6 months were electric. I led a small team, introduced a few bold initiatives. At first, people clapped. But then, the clapping stopped. My ideas were too different, too loud, too much. The director of operations, Martin, once told me, "You've got a lot of passion. Just be careful not to overpower the room." I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. They didn't want my voice. They wanted my silence disguised as support. The gala was the company's crown jewel event. Every year, the same faces, the same speeches, the same hierarchy. This year was special, though. The CEO, Eleanor Vaughn, had been through a personal tragedy, losing her son. There were rumors she wouldn't attend. But 2 weeks before the gala, it was confirmed. She'd be there. And for the first time, the closing keynote wouldn't be delivered by an executive. It would be an employee story segment, a human moment. I was asked to help write it, but not deliver it. At first, I didn't mind. I'd ghostwritten before. I crafted something raw, powerful, a message about resilience, grief, and rising after devastation. It was based partly on Eleanor's story, but I wove in my own. They loved it. They clapped in the boardroom. But then Martin said, "We'll have Jason deliver it. He's more relatable." Jason. Jason had been in marketing for 2 years. He was charming, yes, but the story wasn't his. He didn't know what it meant to be silenced by pain, or ignored in a room that once welcomed you. Still, I smiled. Said, "Of course." I went home that night and cried into my pillow like a child. Not because of Jason, but because I realized I'd become too comfortable in invisibility. The morning of the gala, something changed. I looked in the mirror and said it out loud. "You deserve to be seen." That night, when my boss leaned in and told me to stay quiet, I saw his eyes flinch when I didn't respond right away. I just smiled, too calmly, too knowingly, and walked away. I had a plan, but it would require perfect timing, and one very risky choice. The ballroom was already glowing when I arrived. Amber lights washing the cream-colored walls, tall crystal vases on each table filled with white orchids, soft jazz in the background like a spell to keep people from speaking too honestly. I was early, as always. I watched the room fill up slowly, heels clicking on marble, laughter just a little too loud, people hugging with the stiffness of obligation. These were the architects of appearances, the silent war of status in every handshake. Jason arrived 20 minutes later, looking confident, smooth. He found me near the back of the room, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched. "You nervous for me?" he grinned. I nodded. "You'll do great," I said. And I meant it, in a strange way. He wasn't the villain. He was just the latest golden boy in a long line of golden boys. But he wasn't the one who'd lived that speech. The one they would hear tonight would be different. Backstage, I waited. The plan had taken root slowly. I'd rehearsed it in silence for days. The risk, the fallout, the possibility that I'd never work in the industry again, it didn't matter. There's a kind of bravery that only comes after enough quiet suffering. It's not the bravery of heroes. It's the bravery of survivors. And I had survived so much already. I remembered my mother's face when I told her I got the job. She pursed her lips like she wanted to smile, but then said, "Well, maybe now you'll stop chasing dreams and start being practical." She never asked what I did. My brother would walk into the room with a new girlfriend and a new car, and she would light up like a Christmas tree. I showed her my article published in a major magazine. She said, "Isn't that nice?" without even looking at the title. I stopped trying after that. I stopped showing, but I never stopped building. In the shadows of that office, I built things, systems, campaigns, cultures. I watched other people take the stage with words I wrote, stories I sculpted, and I let it happen because I thought it was what I deserved, until that moment backstage. That night, the CEO arrived just before dinner. The entire room shifted. Eleanor Vaughn wasn't just powerful, she was revered. People whispered her name like a legend. Her story had spread quietly. A private woman with a fortress of discipline, now cracked open by loss. I'd seen her from afar. She'd never once looked my way. But that night, just as she walked by me backstage on her way to her table, our eyes met, and something passed between us. Not recognition, but something quieter, something raw. She knew grief. So did I. The dinner passed in a blur. Speeches, applause, toasts, laughter, but it all blurred together like watercolor bleeding off the page. Then came the moment. The lights dimmed. Jason was backstage, rehearsing his delivery one last time. He asked me, "Do you think they'll like it?" I looked at him and said, "They'll never forget it." That was the truth, because he wouldn't be the one giving it. Right before he stepped on stage, I turned to the assistant producer. "Jason's having stomach cramps." He asked me to go up instead. "I know the speech. I wrote it." She blinked, unsure, then looked at Jason, who was bent over a little. Actually from nerves, not illness, but it looked convincing enough. She hesitated for 1 second, then nodded. "Go." And I walked into the lights. My heels clicked loud across the stage floor. My heart was thundering, but my breath was steady. I approached the mic as the crowd settled into polite anticipation. I didn't look at Jason. I didn't look at my boss. I looked straight at Eleanor, and I began. Grief doesn't make a sound. Not at first. It lives in the silence people avoid. It waits in the pauses of conversations and the corners of crowded rooms. A hush fell over the audience. I kept going. I told the story I had written, but not as a narrator, as the survivor. I spoke of losing someone not to death, but to absence. I spoke of being told to be quiet, to make space, to smile when dismissed. I spoke of carrying voices that weren't mine until mine had no place left to go. I spoke of rebuilding, not in triumph, but in truth, brick by invisible brick. And as I spoke, something changed in the room. People leaned in. My voice didn't tremble. It rose, not loud, but full. When I reached the final line, I paused. "I was told to stay quiet tonight, but silence doesn't honor pain. Truth does." I stepped back. Silence. Then applause, real, unforced, rising like a tide. But I didn't hear any of it, because I was looking at Eleanor. She had tears in her eyes, and she was clapping. I stepped off the stage slowly, like walking away from a fire that had finally burned itself out. The applause still echoed, but it wasn't for validation. Not for me. It was for something else. Truth, maybe, or release. A room full of people, finally listening to something real. Jason stood just outside the curtains, stunned, not angry, just confused. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. I gently touched his arm as I passed. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. If he hadn't been willing to play along with the discomfort of the moment, if he had insisted or told someone, none of this would have happened. The assistant producer rushed up next, eyes wide. "That was incredible," she whispered. I wasn't sure what to do, but I'm glad I let you." "You didn't let me," I said quietly. "You trusted the truth. Thank you for that." Back in the ballroom, the air was different now. People weren't performing anymore. Their smiles had softened. Their eyes were more present. Something had cracked open, and in the cracks, light was coming in. But my boss, he didn't clap, he didn't smile. He avoided eye contact completely, shifting in his chair, whispering something to Martin. I expected that. What I didn't expect was what came next. Eleanor stood, slowly, and took the stage again, even though her part had been concluded earlier. The entire room froze. She took the mic and looked around. No smile, no speech. Just her voice, steady and low. I lost my son last year, she said. And tonight I finally heard someone speak to the silence he left behind. That wasn't a performance. That was a gift. A gift this company hasn't always been brave enough to receive. The room didn't dare breathe. She turned, looked directly at me. I didn't know your name before tonight, she said. I do now. Then she stepped down. That moment rewrote everything. Afterward, people came up to me one by one. Not the executives, most of them stayed back, but employees, assistants, interns, even someone from finance. Thank you, they said, over and over. Some had tears in their eyes. Others just touched my hand briefly, like it meant something. I left early. I needed air. I didn't want to ruin the purity of what had just happened by staying too long in the place where I had once been invisible. The elevator ride down was quiet, but when I stepped outside, I found someone waiting for me on the sidewalk. It was Dana, from legal, one of the few people who'd always been kind to me without agenda. She smiled and handed me a paper cup of tea. You made the CEO cry, she said with a half smile. Not bad for someone who was told to stay quiet. I laughed softly. Do you think I'm going to be fired? Dana looked up at the sky. I think they don't know what to do with you now, and that's a good thing. That night, I walked home instead of taking a cab. My phone buzzed nonstop, messages, emails, missed calls. I turned it off, not out of fear, but because I needed to be in that silence for a little while. My silence, not the kind they gave me, but the kind I chose. The next morning, I arrived at the office at my usual time. I didn't expect anyone to say anything. Most didn't. Some offered polite nods. Others avoided me entirely. Jason gave me a thumbs up from across the hall. But when I sat at my desk, there was a note. Folded, unmarked. I opened it slowly. Come to the 42nd floor at noon. E. The 42nd floor was the executive suite. I had never been invited there before. At noon, I took the elevator up with a calm I didn't fully understand. The receptionist didn't ask me anything. She just said, "Go right in." Eleanor was standing near the window, looking out over the skyline. She didn't turn right away. I haven't seen the city this clearly in a while, she said. Sometimes grief clouds everything. I didn't speak. She turned finally. Her eyes were tired but kind. She gestured to a chair. I sat. I need someone to help me reshape the way this company tells stories, she said simply. Not branding, not fluff. Real stories, the kind you told last night. I think people are starving for them. I want you to lead that. I blinked. Me? Yes, she said. You. I didn't say yes right away, because I needed to understand what kind of power I was stepping into, but I also knew something had changed forever. And this time, I would not stay quiet. I left that office with my heart pounding, not from nerves, but from something deeper, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. I think it was being seen, not for being agreeable or efficient or reliable, but for the fire I kept hidden for so long, for the voice they tried to mute behind polite smiles and empty compliments. Back at my desk, everything looked the same. The same stack of files, the same half-used notepad, the same framed photo of my college graduation I kept tucked behind the monitor so no one could see it. But I was different now. I wasn't going to tuck myself behind anything ever again. I didn't tell anyone what Eleanor had said to me. Not yet. I wasn't looking for congratulations. I needed time to process what it meant to be asked to lead something I had once only dared to whisper about in the dark. That night, I visited my grandmother. She lived in a small brick house just outside the city, with a creaky porch and hydrangeas that never bloomed the same way twice. She was one of the few people in my life who had never asked me to shrink. She always said I had too much heart for small places, and I think she knew that heart had been hiding. We sat on her porch with mugs of chamomile, the sun setting behind the oak trees in the distance. I told her everything, the gala, the speech, the invitation, the risk. She listened in silence like she always did. Then she smiled in that quiet way of hers. No teeth, just warmth. I knew it was in you, she said. But I almost didn't do it, I admitted. I almost let them silence me again. You didn't, though, she replied. And now you know you never have to. We talked for hours. About old dreams, about buried pain, about the power of choosing yourself even when no one else does. And as I left that night, she pressed a small envelope into my hand. Don't open it yet, she said. Wait until you forget why you started. Then read it. I nodded, confused but grateful. Back at work, things shifted, slowly at first. People started stopping by my desk more, asking questions, sharing ideas. A few even thanked me in hushed tones, as if what I'd done had given them permission to be something more than invisible. My boss, however, remained distant. He avoided direct interaction, delegating anything related to me through email or intermediaries. One morning, I found out he had removed me from a project I had initiated weeks earlier. No explanation, just erased. And yet, I didn't feel erased. Not anymore, because something else had started. Eleanor invited me to weekly meetings, not just with her, but with a small circle of department heads. Creative, legal, HR. She called it the story core. Our job was to build a new communication culture from the inside out. Transparent, human, brave, and she wanted me to lead it. The first meeting was awkward. Half the room didn't know why I was there. The other half resented that they did. But I showed up anyway. Not loud, not angry, just present. I started with one question. What's one thing you wish you could say at work but never do? There was a long silence. Then Dana from legal said, I wish I could admit I feel overwhelmed sometimes. Another said, I wish I didn't have to pretend I'm okay when I'm not. And one by one, the walls began to crumble. By the third meeting, people were volunteering stories, real ones, not the polished versions we put in newsletters, but messy, brave, imperfect truths, and it was working. Meanwhile, my old boss watched from the sidelines, his influence slowly fading. People still respected him on paper. But in the quiet moments, in the elevator, in break rooms, over coffee, they came to me, because I wasn't selling them success. I was offering them honesty. One day, I walked past his office and saw him staring at his computer, motionless. Our eyes met. He didn't look away. But he didn't smile either. I didn't need him to. He had nothing left to take from me. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a leadership summit the company was sponsoring. It would be the biggest stage yet, over 500 people, including top clients, partners, and media. Eleanor pulled me aside and said, You don't have to do this. But if you do, don't water yourself down. Give them the fire. I said yes, because I was ready. Because this time, I wasn't just speaking for myself. I was speaking for every quiet person who had been told to stay in their lane, for every brilliant mind passed over because they weren't loud enough, or smooth enough, or privileged enough, and because I had something to say, something that might just set the whole room on fire in the best possible way. The day of the summit, I woke up before sunrise. The city was still asleep, the streets barely lit, the sky just beginning to peel away its darkness. I stood at my window with a cup of black coffee in my hand, watching the light creep across the buildings like courage rising in a chest. I didn't write a new speech. I didn't rehearse in front of a mirror. Instead, I wrote a letter to myself, the version of me who once sat in bathroom stalls during lunch breaks because she couldn't handle the weight of being overlooked anymore. I told her she was still here, still standing, still whole. I wore a deep red suit that day. Not loud, but unapologetic. A color I never would have dared to wear in my early days. I used to choose gray, navy, black, colors that didn't attract attention, but now I wanted to be seen. Not because I needed applause, but because I finally believed I deserved the space I occupied. At the summit, I was escorted backstage early. The space buzzed with nervous energy, camera crews adjusting lights, organizers speaking into earpieces, the smell of expensive perfume mixed with the sharp tang of anticipation. The main speaker before me was a former politician known for charisma. The kind of man people called visionary, even when he said nothing at all. He exited the stage to generous applause. I waited behind the curtain, hands clasped, breath slow. Dana was there too, offering me a nod of quiet solidarity. She didn't have to say anything. Her presence was enough. Then the announcer called my name, not with grandeur, just with clarity. I stepped out into the light. The room was massive, hundreds of eyes. The clink of silverware paused. People sat back, curious, some skeptical, some eager. I didn't walk to the podium. I walked past it, to the edge of the stage, and I began. Not long ago, I was asked to stay quiet at a gala like this one. I had written a speech, but I wasn't meant to speak it. I was told to let others shine. So I did something different. I stepped into the light and told the truth instead. I saw recognition ripple through the crowd. A few gasps. Some leaned in. Others folded their arms. Good. I wanted them uncomfortable. I wanted them honest. I told them about silence, about the kind of workplace where people bury their brilliance under fear. I told them about the subtle cruelty of being excluded from decisions you helped shape, of hearing your ideas credited to someone else, of giving your best and being treated like background noise. And I didn't tell it with anger. I told it with fire. Then I paused and told them about the turning point, about stepping onto that gala stage, about the tears in the CEO's eyes, about what can happen when someone finally refuses to shrink. And then I said this: companies don't fail because of bad strategy. They fail because of unspoken truth. They rot from the silence inward. But when we let people speak, the real people, not just the polished ones, we build something stronger than brand. We build trust. Silence. Then thunder. Applause so loud it made the walls vibrate. And as I turned to leave the stage, I saw something that nearly undid me. My mother. In the back row. She had flown in without telling me. Her hands clasped over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I hadn't seen her cry since I was a child. After the event, she found me in the hallway. She was shaking. Her voice broke. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't see what they were doing to you. I didn't see what I did to you. I didn't speak right away." Then I said, "You don't have to fix the past. Just believe me now." She nodded. And for the first time, I believed her silence was full of remorse, not dismissal. Back at work, everything changed faster. Eleanor made my position official, director of story culture. I had a team, a budget, a mission. But more than that, I had the freedom to be exactly who I was. No disguise, no filter. Even my old boss resigned 2 months later. No big announcement, just a quiet exit, a relic of an era that no longer fit. And one afternoon, when I was cleaning out my drawer to move offices, I found that envelope my grandmother had given me. I opened it. It said, "When the world tries to silence you, sing louder. Not for them, for yourself." Weeks passed, then months. But something inside me never settled back into normal. It couldn't. I had tasted the freedom of being fully, fearlessly myself. And once you cross that threshold, there's no going back. I no longer apologized for taking up space in meetings. I didn't shrink when others raised their voices. I didn't defer to people just because they wore more expensive suits or had fancier titles. I had learned that impact isn't measured in volume. It's measured in presence. In truth, the people around me noticed. Some with admiration, some with unease. But what mattered most was that they noticed at all. And yet, even with all the progress, there were still echoes of the past. One morning, I was invited to speak at a high-level strategy session, something I'd never been asked to do before. It was hosted by the board itself. As I entered the room, I could feel the weight of old dynamics tugging at me. The long table, the crisp suits, the air thick with control. Martin was there. He gave me a tight-lipped smile. The same man who once told me I was too much for the room. I sat down slowly, opened my folder, and waited. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't perform. I didn't pretend. I just told the truth. I shared what I'd learned over the past months. Not in abstract strategy terms, but in stories. About employees who had found their voice. About departments that had reconnected through vulnerability. About the quiet revolution happening beneath the surface of the company's glossy exterior. They listened. Some with interest, some with skepticism. But no one interrupted. And as I closed my remarks, I looked straight at Martin. "Culture isn't built in memos or mission statements," I said. "It's built in the moments we choose to hear each other, and the moments we don't." The room fell quiet. Martin lowered his gaze. After the session, the chairwoman approached me privately. She had gray streaks in her hair and a sharp, kind face. "You spoke like someone who's lived through fire," she said. "I have," I answered. She smiled. "Then keep going. You're the kind of fire this place needs." That day, I realized something important. I wasn't fighting for approval anymore. I wasn't trying to prove my worth to people who'd never be able to see it. I was speaking for the ones who did, and there were more of them than I'd imagined. Over time, our story core grew. We began holding storytelling circles across departments, voluntary sessions where people could show up and just be human. We created a podcast that featured real stories from real employees, not the polished, PR-ready stuff, but actual journeys, the messy kind, the kind that made people lean in and say, "Me too." One day, a janitor named Jorge came up to me in the hallway. He looked nervous. "I listened to the latest episode," he said. "The one about the woman who used to stutter. I shared it with my daughter. She struggles with reading and it made her cry, in a good way." I thanked him. I wanted to hug him, but I just held his eyes and nodded, because that's what this was about. Not glory, not recognition, but connection. One afternoon, Eleanor stopped by my new office. She didn't knock. She just stepped in and handed me a folder. "I need your help with something," she said. Inside was the outline for a new initiative, a company-wide event, not another gala, something bolder. She called it the Voice Project. Its goal? To dismantle hierarchy through story, to flip the microphone, to make the listeners the ones who usually spoke, and the speakers the ones who were usually silent. It was ambitious, risky, vulnerable, and perfect. We planned for weeks. Logistics, teams, themes. I worked late nights, re-listening to old recordings, curating sessions, coaching people who'd never spoken in public before. And when the day came, it was nothing like the gala. There were no chandeliers, no crystal, just folding chairs, warm lighting, and raw human truth. One by one, people got up and told their stories. A security guard talked about the isolation of night shifts. A single mother in HR shared how hard it was to feel seen when she couldn't attend after-hours events. A former executive admitted he'd been wrong, that he'd led with fear because he didn't know how else to lead. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, including mine. And when it was over, when the last story was told and the last tear dried, Eleanor stepped forward and took the mic. She looked around the room and said, This is what leadership should feel like." And in that moment, I felt something crack open inside me again. Not from pain this time, but from purpose. The morning after the Voice Project, the office felt different. The elevators moved slower, or maybe people were just walking more deliberately. There was a kind of reverence in the air, like something sacred had happened the day before, and no one wanted to break it. Conversations were softer, but deeper. You could hear people saying things like, "I never knew that about her," or "He's been working here for 10 years and I never saw him like that." And yet not everyone celebrated it. A handful of managers sent cold emails the next day, questioning the productivity impact of emotional storytelling and urging a return to operational focus. One even called it a distraction, but that only confirmed what we already knew. Change reveals who's willing to evolve and who's clinging to power. Still, I didn't let it shake me. I met with those skeptics one by one, not to argue but to listen, to model the very vulnerability they were afraid of. And slowly, one by one, the walls started to soften. Not all the way, but enough to matter. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a university where Eleanor had once taught. She wanted me to represent the company's new direction. I agreed, but I knew this would be different. These were students, wide-eyed, skeptical, ambitious. They didn't care about titles. They wanted truth, so I gave it to them. I stood in that old lecture hall and said, "You will be told to stay quiet." Not directly. Not always in words. Sometimes in tone, in looks, in exclusion. But the message will be clear. Shrink to fit. I paused. And when that happens, I want you to remember something. Silence can protect you, but it can also erase you. After the talk, a young woman with a notebook full of scribbles approached me. Her eyes were wide, brimming with something unspoken. "My professor says I talk too much in class," she said. "But today, you made me feel like I don't talk enough." I smiled and touched her arm gently. "Talk louder," I said. "The world needs it." Back at work, the momentum kept building. Departments that had never collaborated before began creating internal storyboards, culture journals, empathy briefings. HR integrated storytelling into onboarding. Communications scrapped their sterile newsletters and began publishing anonymous reflections from real employees. It was messy, imperfect, sometimes even uncomfortable, but it was alive. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. I was nominated for an award. Not within the company, but at a national conference for workplace transformation. I wasn't even aware of it until Eleanor forwarded me the email. She had submitted my name without telling me. At first, I didn't know how to feel. Pride, gratitude, imposter syndrome. But then I remembered the girl who used to sit outside company events pretending to be busy so no one would notice she hadn't been invited inside. She would have wanted this. At the award ceremony, I wore the same red suit. Not because I couldn't afford a new one, but because it reminded me of that first day I chose to be seen. As I stood on stage to accept the award, I didn't talk about strategy, or KPIs, or initiatives. I talked about the night I was told to stay quiet, and how that moment changed everything. I was never loud, I said, but silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes silence is just someone waiting to be heard on their own terms. The applause was warm, not explosive, not theatrical, but real. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I looked out over the city skyline. I thought about every person who had tried to dim my light, about every email that went unanswered, every meeting where my ideas were repeated by someone louder and given credit to someone else. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because I had finally built something bigger than it. The following Monday, as I walked into the building with the award still wrapped in tissue in my bag, something small but extraordinary happened. The security guard, Marcus, who usually gave me a quiet nod and a polite smile, stood up from behind his desk and offered a slow clap. Just 3 or 4 claps, deliberate and proud. "No more quiet entrances," he said with a grin. I smiled, a real one, and nodded back. No more. That moment stayed with me the whole morning. Not because of the gesture, but because of who it came from. Marcus had watched me enter that building for years. He had seen me come in with hunched shoulders, eyes down, pretending not to care that I wasn't invited into the rooms that mattered. He had seen the before, and now he saw the after. Later that week, I hosted a roundtable for new hires. It had been my idea to create a monthly session where employees could meet with someone outside their direct chain of command, someone who'd walked the quiet path and made it through. We called it the first voice. That day, one of the interns, Rachel, a shy young woman with sleeves that covered her wrists and a voice barely louder than a whisper, raised her hand near the end. "How do you know when it's safe to speak?" she asked. The room went still. I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang, heavy and fragile. Then I said, "You don't." Her eyes widened. "You don't wait for safety. You wait for readiness. There's a difference," I explained. Safety is external. Readiness is yours. When you're ready to speak, even if your voice shakes, even if you're terrified, you've already won. Rachel nodded slowly. Her lips parted like she wanted to say more, but instead she just gave me the kind of look I used to give people I admired from a distance. It made me ache a little. After the session, she approached me at the coffee station. Her voice was steadier now. "My mom died last year," she said, "and I haven't said that out loud at work until now." I looked her in the eye. "You just did." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months, maybe years. That's what this journey had become. Not just mine anymore, but a ripple. A quiet uprising of truth inside a system that once demanded performance over presence. And then, because the world is never done testing you, I received a call. It was from a high-level executive at a rival firm. He had heard my keynote, read the articles, seen the culture shift, and he wanted to offer me a position. Higher salary, bigger team, full creative control. It was tempting. On paper, it was everything I'd once dreamed of. But as I sat on my balcony that night, watching the lights flicker across the city, I thought about more than just paper. I thought about Marcus, about Rachel, about Eleanor, who took a chance on me when I was still learning to stand up straight again. I thought about every email from employees saying, "Your story gave me courage." And I realized something simple and terrifying. I wasn't building a career. I was building a legacy. So I said no, not because I was afraid to leave, but because I had more to do where I was. The next morning, I told Eleanor. She didn't try to talk me out of leaving. She just listened. And when I said, "I turned it down," she nodded once, slowly. Then she said, "Good, because I need you to help me write the next chapter." It wasn't a metaphor. She had plans, big ones. She wanted to restructure the company's leadership development program, from top to bottom, and she wanted me to co-lead it, but only if I was ready. I looked her in the eye and said, "I've been ready. I just didn't know anyone else was." She smiled. "Now we are." And just like that, the story that began with silence was turning into something much louder, much bigger, and far more beautiful than I could have imagined. Building something new is never clean. It's not like in the movies where transformation comes with montage music and tidy conclusions. It's more like learning how to walk again, with bruises, with awkward steps, with the echo of your former self tugging at your ankles. That's what it felt like when we started restructuring the leadership development program. Eleanor didn't want checklists. She wanted leaders who could sit in discomfort, people who could hold silence without needing to fill it with ego. So we redesigned everything. No more lectures from executives who read from slides. We invited janitors to speak about perseverance, single parents to talk about resilience. We held workshops on active listening and storytelling that replaced the traditional team-building games. The first cohort, skeptical. Half of them had been in leadership for decades. They came in with arms crossed, smirking. One even said, "I didn't come here to sing Kumbaya." But 2 hours into the first session, when Jorge, the janitor, stood up and talked about being invisible for 20 years, despite knowing the names and birthdays of everyone in his building, the room changed. When he finished, no one clapped. They just stood, not because someone told them to, but because standing was the only thing their bodies knew how to do in that moment. That session became legend in the company. People whispered about it, not in gossip, but in reverence. And something cracked, not just in the program, in the culture itself. More people started asking to participate. More departments volunteered to host. Even those who'd once rolled their eyes now leaned in. But with every gain came resistance. An executive, someone who'd once been close to Martin, sent a scathing memo questioning the ROI of the new approach. He accused us of prioritizing emotion over execution, said our sessions were therapy disguised as strategy. Eleanor forwarded the memo to me, no commentary, just the subject line. "Want to respond?" I sat with it for a while. Then I wrote back, not with data, not with defense, with story. I shared 3 anonymous letters I'd received that week from employees whose teams had transformed after attending our sessions. I told the story of a manager who finally apologized to a direct report for years of micromanaging. I told the story of a woman who finally applied for a promotion after 3 years of convincing herself she didn't belong. I ended with a single sentence. "If you think this isn't strategy, you've never seen what a healed team can build." I never got a reply. But he never sent another memo. Months later, that same executive attended a session himself. He didn't speak much, just listened. At the end, he waited until the room was almost empty, then came up to me and said, "I still don't get it, but something happened here today. Sometimes that's enough." One night, walking home after a late session, I passed a bookstore and saw a window display titled "Voices That Changed Culture." On the second row, to my disbelief, sat a copy of the company's new culture handbook, something my team and I had co-authored over months. I stood there, frozen. It wasn't fame. It wasn't a bestseller. But it was there. It existed in the world. Proof that our voices had become visible. That night, I opened the envelope my grandmother had once given me a second time. I read the same sentence. "When the world tries to silence you, sing louder." But this time, I heard something different. It wasn't just her voice echoing anymore. It was mine. It was Rachel's. It was Jorge's. It was all of us. We had created a chorus where there had once only been whispers, and the song was just getting started. One morning, 6 months after the first gala speech, I arrived to find a handwritten card on my desk. No envelope, just the words, "You changed the way I see leadership. Thank you." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name, because it didn't matter who had written it. What mattered was that someone, somewhere in the upper floors of this building, had begun to understand what we were fighting for. Not recognition, not rebellion, but reclamation. Of voice, of dignity, of truth. The movement wasn't just a program anymore. It had a pulse, an identity, a language. People began using our terminology without even realizing it. Voice moments, first truths, legacy culture. The ideas had seeped into the bloodstream of the company. One day, a younger analyst approached me in the cafeteria. "I used to think leadership was about being the loudest," she said. "Now I think it's about being the clearest. You taught me that." I smiled. "Clarity changes everything." She nodded. So does kindness. That afternoon, I sat in on a session led by Rachel. Yes, Rachel. The same intern who once asked how to know when it was safe to speak. Now she was leading. Confident, measured, luminous. She guided the room like a lighthouse. Not demanding attention, but drawing it naturally, like gravity. After the session, she pulled me aside. Her voice was steady now. Firm. I got accepted to grad school, she said. Public leadership. I'm going. Because of this. I didn't cry. I just pulled her in and whispered, "Sing louder." It had become our language now. One by one, the people who had once hidden behind their titles or tasks were stepping out. Even Dana, the quiet force in legal, shared her own story at a senior summit. She talked about being the first woman in her family to go to college, about being passed over for promotions, about learning to say, "No, I disagree," without apologizing. The room gave her a standing ovation. Eleanor was there too. She looked at me with eyes that said more than words ever could. But the real test came when we were invited to partner with another company, one known for its cold efficiency. They wanted a culture injection, as they called it. I hesitated. So did Eleanor. "Why us?" she asked in the first meeting. Their executive team said, "Because your people actually talk like they care." We knew it would be hard, but we said yes. We sent a small delegation, myself, Rachel, Jorge, and 2 others. On the first day, we walked into their headquarters. It felt like a museum of silence, polished, immaculate, emotionless. They looked at us like we were a traveling improv troupe, but we started the same way we always did, with story. Jorge opened the first session. He spoke about his early years, cleaning offices while dreaming of his son's graduation. He cried. No one moved. Until finally, a man in the back, clearly high level, stood up and said, "I haven't cried in 20 years. I thought I forgot how." And just like that, the thaw began. By the end of the week, they were talking differently. Not dramatically, but with less armor. They asked for more sessions. They asked for us to stay. And it hit me. What we were doing wasn't a strategy. It was a seed, planted deep in people's need to be known. I flew home that weekend and visited my grandmother. She was older now, slower, but her eyes still burned with that quiet fire. She listened as I told her everything. And when I finished, she reached out, took my hand, and said, "Your story outgrew you." I asked her what she meant. She said, "It's not just yours anymore. It belongs to everyone who needed it." And she was right. I wasn't just telling my story now. I was holding space for others to tell theirs. And in doing so, I was finally free. Freedom doesn't always feel like a grand explosion. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like realizing you haven't apologized for existing in a week, or noticing that you walk taller, breathe deeper, take up space without shrinking first. That's what it felt like to wake up each morning knowing I wasn't surviving anymore. I was shaping something, changing something, becoming something I hadn't dared to believe I could be. The recognition followed, slowly but surely. Articles were written about the transformation of our company's culture. Panels were hosted. Podcasts requested interviews. But none of it compared to what happened one Friday morning. I received an email from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. My brother. The same brother my family had praised for years while ignoring every one of my milestones. The golden child. The one who once said, "I just don't get what you do. Sounds like fluff." The email was short. Just 3 sentences. "Saw your story online. Watched your speech. I didn't understand before. I do now." I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and cried. Not because I needed his validation, but because I had lived so long assuming I would never get it, and I was okay with that. But sometimes healing arrives when you've stopped asking for it. And in its quiet way, it still knocks you over. That weekend, I spoke at a youth leadership retreat. A mix of high schoolers and early college students, all eyes and questions and adrenaline. I told them the same truth I had told boardrooms. That voice inside you, the one they said was too loud, too sensitive, too emotional, that voice is the thing that will change your world if you protect it. Afterward, a boy approached me. He had speech disfluency, took effort with each word. But he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm going to speak anyway." I didn't say anything. I just placed my hand on his shoulder and nodded, because that was enough, because it was everything. And that's when I knew. This wasn't about a company anymore, or even a movement. It was about a generation of people who had been trained to mute themselves and were now learning, one by one, to sing louder. Back at the office, we started preparing for the next big event. Not a gala, a gathering. We called it The Story of Us. It wasn't a showcase. It wasn't for clients or investors. It was for us. Every department, every floor. One day where the only goal was to listen. To each other, to ourselves, to the things we never had space to say. We set up circles instead of rows. We removed microphones. We invited people to bring one object that represented their story. A photo, a notebook, a pair of shoes, a recipe card, a dried flower. The stories that followed were holy. A man in accounting spoke about losing his wife and how he used spreadsheets to feel in control again. A woman in IT described her childhood in foster care and how fixing things made her feel like she mattered. A receptionist brought a book of poems she'd written and never shared. People cried, people laughed, people exhaled. And when it ended, no one wanted to leave. I stood by the doorway and watched them linger. One woman hugged me and said, "This saved my job." Another whispered, "This saved me." I walked home that night in the rain without an umbrella. Let it soak through my hair, my jacket, my skin. Because for once, I wasn't running from anything. I was walking toward it. And I knew, this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the next breath. Spring came. The kind of spring that feels earned after a brutal winter. Not just in weather, but in life. Trees that once looked like skeletons were suddenly dressed in green again. People opened their windows, laughed louder, stopped hunching into their coats, and I did too. One afternoon, I walked through the company garden, a small courtyard space that had once been used for smoke breaks and now held benches, lights, and wildflowers. A place where people gathered in pairs or sat alone thinking. A place that had become sacred without anyone needing to say so. I saw Jorge sitting there with his lunch. He waved me over. "You've created something," he said. I laughed. "I think we created something." He looked down at the sandwich in his hand and said, "Nah, you started the song. We just joined the chorus." I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat with him, quiet, present. It was enough. But change has a way of testing its messengers. And just as I had settled into this new rhythm of purpose, I was called into an unexpected meeting with Eleanor and 2 board members. The tone wasn't tense, but it was formal. They offered me a promotion, Senior Vice President of Culture Transformation, a title I never imagined would exist, let alone belong to me. But with it came a catch. They wanted me to travel more, speak at events, represent the brand, be the face of what we'd done. It sounded like everything I once wanted, but I hesitated because I knew the cost. Less time with the people, less time in the garden, less time in the rooms where stories were told, not curated. I didn't want to become a symbol. I wanted to stay a witness. Eleanor noticed. "You don't have to answer now," she said. "Just know you've earned it." That night, I sat on my apartment floor with a cup of tea and an old photo album. I found a picture of myself at 23, standing in a crowd of graduates holding my diploma like it was a secret. I remember what I felt that day. Hope mixed with terror. The belief that I had something to say, and the fear that no one would ever let me say it. I closed the album and thought about legacy. And then I remembered Rachel, and Jorge, and the boy with the speech disfluency. And I knew my answer. The next morning, I met with Eleanor alone. "I'm honored," I told her. "But I'm already in the role I was born to fill." She didn't argue. She just smiled. "Then let's protect it." So we restructured. We created a new department beneath me. Story development and culture design. I wouldn't be removed from the rooms I loved. I would help build more of them. I hired Rachel full-time, promoted Jorge into a new role, cultural facilitator. We began training new voices, people who could carry this work long after we were gone. One of them was a woman in facilities named Ruth. She was 62, thought she had nothing to say. Until she told a story about growing up in a town that didn't allow girls to speak in church, and how as a child she would whisper sermons to herself in the closet, just to feel what it might be like to be heard. When she told that story during a session, people wept, and I realized, this story, this thing we started, it was no longer mine. It had become a movement. It had become theirs. And for the first time, I understood what it meant to lead, not with power, but with presence. Autumn arrived with its usual sense of nostalgia, but this time it didn't feel like loss. It felt like a settling, like the earth exhaling after holding itself up all summer. I was different too, no longer pushing against the current, but flowing with it. Not because the work had become easier, but because I had become stronger. One crisp October morning, I was asked to speak at the annual Leadership Summit again, the same event where I had first shared my truth and made the CEO cry. This time, though, it wasn't as a risk. It was as the headliner. The invitation came with no restrictions, no guidelines, no stay quiet. Just, please tell us what we need to hear. That sentence alone made me pause, because I had learned something along the way. When people finally ask for the truth, they may not be prepared for its weight. I stood backstage that morning in a different suit. Not red. This time, charcoal gray. Simple, strong, grounded. My fingers traced the edge of a folded note in my pocket. My grandmother's handwriting. Still with me. Still guiding me. The moment they called my name, I walked out slowly, scanning the crowd. So many new faces. A few familiar ones. Eleanor in the front row, hands clasped, eyes steady. Rachel and Jorge beside her. Ruth, too. I took the mic and began. I want to tell you a story, I said. And I did. I told the story of a girl who used to eat lunch alone in stairwells, of a woman who was told to smile more, talk less, and be grateful, of an employee who ghost wrote speeches that made other people famous while sitting in silence, of a voice that was buried under layers of doubt and dismissal, and how that voice chose, one night, not to stay quiet. I told them about the ripple that followed, the voices that rose, the culture that healed, the lives that shifted, not from grandeur, but from honesty. And then I said, leadership is not the loudest voice in the room. It's the one that makes others brave enough to speak. Silence. Not out of discomfort. Out of reverence. I ended with something simple. You are not too much. You are not too emotional. You are not too loud. You are a story that someone else needs to hear to survive. The applause wasn't immediate. It built slowly, like thunder rolling in after lightning strikes. And when it finally broke, it shook the room. Afterward, I stepped outside. The cold hit my cheeks, but I welcomed it. And then I heard someone call my name. It was my mother. She had flown in again. This time, she wasn't crying. She looked at me, really looked, and said, I think I always knew. I just didn't know how to say it. I nodded. You just did. We hugged. Not like before. Like equals. Like women who had both learned what it means to find your voice in a world that benefits from your silence. Later that night, I stood on my balcony and watched the city breathe. And I made myself a promise. I would never speak for applause. I would speak for the quiet ones still waiting to find their moment. Because that's where the magic begins. In the moments before the sound, in the inhale, in the silence that says, I am ready. The end didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like light coming through a door I didn't even realize I had opened. Everything I had once hoped for, respect, impact, presence, it had arrived, yes. But it hadn't come with glitter or trumpets. It had arrived quietly, in the hands of others, in the stories they now told, in the courage they carried forward. I began receiving letters, not from executives, from strangers, assistants, freelancers, students. People who had heard about the gala speech, or listened to a podcast, or attended one of our storytelling workshops. People who said they'd almost quit, almost gave up, almost disappeared. One of the letters read, I watched the video of your first speech. I'd been sitting in my car for 2 hours thinking about quitting my job and walking away from everything. But then you said, silence doesn't honor pain. Truth does. I started crying so hard I forgot I was afraid. I walked into work and asked for a conversation I've been avoiding for years. It changed everything. Thank you for showing me how. I printed it. I kept it in my journal. Not because I needed the praise, but because that letter held something sacred, proof that honesty has gravity, that stories don't just land, they grow. And one afternoon, sitting in a quiet cafe downtown, I realized I no longer needed to prove anything. Not to my old boss, not to the board, not to my family, not even to the younger version of myself who used to practice speeches in the mirror and then delete them from her phone in shame. I had already spoken. I had already been heard. And now, I could listen. I began mentoring younger employees more directly, not in workshops or meetings, but over coffee, walks, real conversations. I told them everything I wish someone had told me, about boundaries, about dignity, about how the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's peace. I spent weekends volunteering with a nonprofit that taught storytelling to teenage girls in underserved communities. I watched them stand up and say things like, "I'm not afraid anymore," and "This is who I am." And I knew they wouldn't need a gala moment. They were already singing. And then one day, Eleanor called me into her office. Her eyes were different that morning, softer, heavier. She told me she was retiring. Not next year. Now. And she wanted to name me as her successor. I was stunned. "Are you sure?" I asked. She smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything. This place doesn't need a hero. It needs a witness. Someone who listens. Someone who knows that change begins the moment someone dares to speak the truth. That someone is you." I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because the emotion had turned into something else. Clarity. I said yes. And on my first official day as CEO, I didn't give a grand speech. I simply gathered the company in the courtyard garden, the same place where Jorge had once told me I started the song. I stood before them in quiet, deliberate stillness. And I said, "I was once told to stay quiet during the gala." A pause. But I spoke. And someone cried. And that one moment became 100, 1,000. And now we are here, together, not because of one voice, but because we all chose to stop hiding. Then I said the one phrase that had carried us all this way. "Sing louder." And they did. Not with words, with applause, with presence, with truth. The garden echoed with it. And in that moment, I closed my eyes. Not because I needed to hold on to anything, but because I finally knew I was home, not in a place, in a voice, my own, and it was never going quiet again. If you've stayed with me until the end, thank you. Not just for listening to my story, but for allowing space in your heart for something more than noise, for truth, for quiet bravery, for the reminder that sometimes the most powerful voices aren't the loudest. They're the ones that refuse to stay silent even when no one is watching. I didn't share this for applause. I shared it because someone out there, maybe you, has been told to shrink, to soften your edges, to make yourself small enough to fit someone else's comfort. Maybe you've been told that your story isn't worth hearing, that your emotions are too much, that your ideas only matter when someone else says them louder. And if that's you, hear me now. Your voice matters. Not because it's perfect, not because it wins awards, but because it's yours. Because buried inside your story is the very strength someone else is praying to find in themselves. You don't need a gala to reclaim your voice. You don't need a stage or a microphone. Sometimes all it takes is saying, "No, I won't disappear." Or, "Yes, I deserve to be here." So if today you're standing at a crossroads, wondering whether to speak up, apply, try again, say what no one else will say, do it. Even if your voice trembles, even if your hands shake, even if no one claps. Because you don't speak to impress. You speak to remember who you are, and who you've always been, beneath the layers of silence. So take this story, not as a blueprint, but as a beginning. Take it into your workplace, into your family, into your heart. Let it remind you that when someone says stay quiet, that's your cue to speak. And if they tell you you're too much, be even more. Be the spark, be the flame, be the voice they never saw coming. Because someone is always listening, even when they pretend not to, even when they act like you're invisible, even when they look away. Someone, somewhere, is waiting for your words to wake them up. So speak, sing, roar if you have to. And when the time comes, don't wait for permission. Just speak. Anyway.